right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker, and I'm excited. I took a week off last week. I was supposed to have a guest, and that didn't work out. Dr. Asher Lancaster Thomas, she's on vacation for the summer. She's emailed me back. She assures me that she'll be on sometime in August, so look forward to that. Fingers crossed that it goes through and we get her on. But yeah, so I took the week off, and I'm working on a new solo show series. So I'm going back to my Existence of God series. And if you recall in the last episodes that I did, I covered the first positive argument for God's existence, the cosmological argument. And that took me a couple years to do just because of some setbacks and stuff like that. But I wrote up my 200-page chapter on the cosmological argument, freely available for you guys on my blog site. And did my videos, detailed videos describing that. I think it's about a 5-part series. And so I want to get back into that finally. And instead of doing what I should be doing, so the original plan is, you look at the positive evidences in favor of God's existence. So starting with the cosmological, then I was going to do the modal ontological argument, moral argument, whatever argument from consciousness, whatever arguments on the positive side I wanted to cover. Then after you establish that, so what I was establishing here is kind of a bottom-up case for the existence of God. So maybe in the cosmological argument, if you remember, I was only arguing for what I called the God one hypothesis. I was not trying to prove that God proper, the being God, the person or personal being that we know, exists directly. I was more trying to prove that what I called the God one hypothesis is true, and that just entails whatever the cosmological argument, my cosmological argument, can prove in terms of the properties or attributes of God. That's all that's entailed via the cosmological argument directly, and that's all that God one is, right? So we proved things like, God is logically, God one hypothesis is a logically necessary or metaphysically necessary explanation for the creation of the universe. God one is eternal. It's a personal agent. It's omnipotent. It's spiritual or supernatural. It's one as opposed to many beings, and it's very powerful. So these were an example of some of the properties that belong to God one, and we finished off with an 86.69% proving that the God one hypothesis is true. Now the next logical step, because we're building a cumulative case in terms of the positive and negative evidences, and starting with the positive evidences, so then I would go to the ontological argument or the moral argument or the teleological, whatever argument it would be. And then, I would establish the God 2 hypothesis, whatever properties can be established with that argument. Then I would combine these properties, right? So in terms of God's being omnipotent, let's say, for example, or a personal being. We have the cosmological argument, that proves that. Does the next argument, the teleological argument, prove a personal agent? Yes. Then we combine that cumulatively and we build up. So each property is separated individually on my Excel spreadsheet. At the end, we multiply it all together, and that gives us the God final hypothesis, what I call the God final hypothesis, otherwise known as close as we can get to the fullness of God the being. So that's the way it should go. And only then, once you've established the God final hypothesis positively, only then should you look at the arguments for atheism that subtract from and say the God final hypothesis is false, or i.e. God proper doesn't exist, assuming that the God final hypothesis is identical to God, which it may not be. I mean, you might not be able to prove everything with arguments for God's existence. I might not be able to prove he's a trinity, so he could be more, kind of thing, right? And the God final hypothesis is careful to say it's just a minimal definition, so it doesn't exclude non-contradictory additional properties that we learn about God maybe through Christian revelation or something like that. So that's the way you're supposed to do this, but I've had some atheists in the audience kind of, after I did my cosmological argument, they requested and said, well, can you do some arguments for atheism? We want to hear you go over that. So I'm going out of order, in an improper order, and because of that, it's going to, I won't be able to do the calculations proper to show you how I do the cumulative case. until I at least do one more positive argument. And that's going to be the modal ontological argument, just so you know. But so yeah, I'm going to be arguing today based on the hiddenness of God argument. That's the argument for atheism that I'm going to be looking at. It's the argument for atheism that I think back when I converted is the strongest, and it's relatively independent of other arguments for and against God's existence, unlike the problem of evil, which is kind of related to different arguments. For example, when I do the problem, my plan when I get to there, I'm going to do the moral argument, followed by the problem of evil for atheism. But then the problem of evil becomes actually a problem for atheists, because there are some philosophers that say the existence of evil proves positively that God exists. So there's an argument for evil for the existence of God, and I'm going to be covering that. So those ones, they're interdependent arguments. The hiddenness of God argument I find is relatively independent, and that's why I have chosen to select this to go over. So I'm just going to assess, that the God final hypothesis is false, given to whatever degree or probability I assign in terms of my subjective probability process. Then you're going to have to wait. I'm not going to try to fit that together. Well, how does that relate to the God one hypothesis? Because again, the arguments for atheism are attacking the God final hypothesis, and we've only got one argument in terms of that, right? So we don't have a cumulative case. But once I get my modal ontological argument on the scene, then I'll show you how the calculations will actually work by assigning the subjective. How do I combine the cosmological, what we've learned there, the properties there, plus the ontological argument? And then, okay, once we get the total from those two, how does that relate with the argument from the hiddenness of God to get a final total, at least based on those three arguments? And you'll kind of get a sense after that as to how the calculations are going to work as we add more and more positive and negative arguments for and against the existence of the God final hypothesis into the mix. So yeah, with that said, that's it by way of introduction. So yeah, this is going to be part one on the hiddenness of God argument for atheism. So let me get into that. Okay, so the first thing to do is to go over, well, what the heck is the hiddenness of God argument for atheism, or it sometimes goes by the name, the argument from Divine Hiddenness. And supposedly this proves atheism, or in our particular case, it proves that God does not exist, aka that the God final hypothesis is false. Now, so it's important to note, so I got a quote here from Jesus. It's a very famous quote. He's up on the cross, Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. And I think that this illustrates the fundamental traditional notion, going back to ancient times, about the argument from Divine Hiddenness. He's up on the cross and he says, look, about the ninth hour, Jesus cries out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My Aramaic is horrible, but that is to say, as the Bible tells us, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you hiding your relational presence from me? This is Jesus on agony on the cross, suffering for our sins to create atonement for us. And it's so important that this line, I think, reveals to us, goes beyond just quoting the psalm. It's showing to us Jesus isn't suffering just physical death or physical suffering on the cross. He's becoming sin for us. He's suffering the consequence of sin, spiritual death, not just physical death, but spiritual death. In other words, relational separation from God. God hid his face from Jesus. And in this moment, why are you forsaking me? He cries out. So it's this understanding of God hiding his face from people that goes back to ancient times, thousands of years before Jesus. In the Bible, we have verses in the Old Testament talking about this, about it seeming like God is hiding from them in certain moments. I need to win this battle. Where are you, God? I need you. I'm depressed. So this is kind of the traditional understanding where God exists. It isn't so much an argument for atheism, but it's an argument that God exists, but there's something wrong. He's hiding from me. He's not a good guy, or there's, what's going on. It's an expression of annoyance or desperation and anxiety in certain circumstances. Now, obviously, in the modern world, divine hiddenness, at least in as is typical in Western philosophy, the hiddenness of God means something totally different. Because obviously, It's referring more to a family of philosophical arguments of various sorts: deductive, inductive, you name it, inference to the best explanation. There's all types. But these are arguments directly for atheism. They're trying to say that this phenomenon of hiddenness, as it were, proves that there is no such thing as a God. And as we're going to find out, refers to a family of arguments. There are various versions, different types, and we'll get to that in a second. But as you can see, look, the phrase divine hiddenness or the hiddenness of God is very much an infelicitous type phrase, right? Because as the name would suggest, it suggests, well, God exists, but he's just hiding from us. It can't be an argument for atheism. So using this phrase is kind of weird in that way. But nonetheless, that's what this nomenclature, this term, divine hiddenness, means in today's Western world in terms of a philosophical argument for atheism. Though, bear in mind, there are actually a few rare philosophical papers in the modern world that do attempt to argue for this first ancient understanding of divine hiddenness, where God exists, but he's hiding, and try to show that that's objectionable in some way. So you have, for example, a 2016 paper by Dewey's Boyd called Lyric Theodicy, Gerald Manley Hopkins, and the problem of existential hiddenness. That's in a book by Eleanor Stump, for example. I have this paper for you on my blogs for free to read by Dr. Garcia, 2002 paper called St. John of the Cross and the Necessity of Divine Hiddenness. So take a look at that paper, and if you want to see these kind of quote-unquote outdated or rare arguments from divine hiddenness in the ancient understanding of the term, take a look at some of these papers. But again, our focus is going to be strictly on the modern typical Western philosophical understanding of the divine hiddenness argument. And on that front, there really is one person. So in the same way with my cosmological argument, I was really inspired in terms of the argument I provided and laying out the details by Dr. Stephen T. Davis's version of the cosmological argument from the contingency of the universe, as it adapted and adopted by Dr. William Lane Craig. I also was heavily influenced by Dr. Alexander Pruse's version of one of his Leibnizian cosmological arguments, and that was kind of my main motivation for the argument that I presented there. In the same way here, I've been heavily influenced by the work, probably the number one atheist philosopher in the world, who's in the modern times brought the argument from divine hiddenness to life. He's the most influential person on this front, and he made a book. He gave his book back in 1993 is when he first did this, and it's the Canadian atheist philosopher Dr. J.L. Schellenberg, who I'm talking about. And he basically made a philosophical argument for atheism based on divine hiddenness, but in terms of, okay, well, what form did the divine hiddenness come in? It's based on a lack of belief in God specifically. That's what hiddenness means. So it's the non-belief in the existence of God in particular that for J.L. Schellenberg's version, that's what he bases his version on. Just out of curiosity, so how does J.L. Schellenberg define divine hiddenness? Obviously, he's the modern architect in the modern world, late 20th and 21st centuries of this argument, and he actually translates hiddenness in a far less literalistic fashion as, quote-unquote, the absence of convincing evidence for the existence of God, or, more specifically, the absence of some kind of positive experimental result in the search for God. And the reason he qualifies that with that positive experimental result, what does that mean? So Schellenberg here is not being a typical fundy-lay atheist and foolishly just saying, oh, well, give us empirical proof. Where's the scientific proof for God? No, Schellenberg's not an idiot like most atheists online are. Sorry, that was way too polemical. I'm going to get that out. Scratch that. Schellenberg is a little bit more nuanced than most atheists online. Let's say it that way. So hopefully that's good for you guys. But he's not limiting it to just a lack of empirical or scientific proof, as though God's a scientific hypothesis or something. No, he just looks, there's got to be some kind of positive experimental result. That could be anything from a religious experience, some kind of divine manifestation. He's really divine revelation. He's open to anything and everything that at least meets rational standards for providing evidence for the existence of God and thereby produces rational belief in the existence of God. That's all he means by positive experimental results. And the lack of that, the lack of positive experimental results producing a justifiable belief in God, is what he calls divine hiddenness. So that gives you kind of a sense of how we're using the phrase in this argument. We're adopting Schellenberg's, for the most part, Schellenberg's understanding here. But what I want you guys to understand here, so there's basically a fundamental structure that underlines all modern arguments from divine hiddenness. And it comes in two, essentially a modus tollens, or denying the consequent type reasoning, right? So you have the first premise one: if God exists, then non-belief does not occur, or divine hiddenness does not occur in whatever form you want to specify. Then you have premise two: but divine hiddenness does occur in whatever form you want to specify. So in Schellenberg's case, non-belief in this way does occur. Therefore, God exists, right? So it's a straightforward denying the consequent type argument here. And this is the fundamental underlying structure that underpins all modern philosophical arguments from divine hiddenness, including J.L. Schellenberg's and the argument that we're going to be looking at specifically here. Now, obviously, they get a lot more complicated if you look at the specific arguments. They, in versions, they've got many more premises. Certainly, our argument is going to be a total of a 9-premise argument, but that includes 2 sub-arguments. So it gets complicated. But the main thing I wanted you to understand here is just the underlying structure, the simple 2-premise argument that underlines every single, or if not virtually every single argument, modern argument from divine hiddenness. You have what's called the incompatibility premise. So that's that conditional statement. If God exists, then hiddenness does not occur. And hiddenness takes whatever form. Obviously, we're going to be looking at the non-belief versions. But and then you have the evidential or empirical premise, which is premise 2. This is where you're denying that consequent, and you say, yeah, but hiddenness does occur. So it's not true that hiddenness does not occur. Therefore, you get God's existing. So those are the 2 essential elements. You have to have the incompatibility premise, something that says, look, the existence of God, once we understand what God is conceptually, is incompatible with, or inconsistent, or contradictory with this phenomenon in the world known as divine hiddenness in whatever form you want to specify. Premise 2 is the empirical or evidential premise that says it is in fact in the world that divine hiddenness phenomenon does exist. Bada boom, bada bing, you've disproven God. So that's the way it works. I want you to keep that fundamental underlying structure, that 2-premise structure in mind, especially when we get to our specific version of the divine hiddenness argument we're going to be using. But just understand, this structure is going to be evidently present in it. Okay, so it's important to note that there may be different forms of what the divine hiddenness phenomenon entails. And Schellenberg's definition of hiddenness kind of hints that there may be other forms, right? So we've specified sort of Schellenberg, and the main way that philosophers do is based on a lack of belief in God's existence, propositional belief. So non-belief in God propositionally is kind of the main phenomenon that most arguments target and that we're going to be focusing on. But there could be other forms of divine hiddenness, lack of positive experimental results. Perhaps, as the ancients said, right? Unanswered prayers. A lot of atheists and skeptics try to argue this way to disprove the Christian God, because the Bible says, hey, pray and you'll get whatever you want. That's not what it says. That's an abuse and misinterpretation of Scripture. It's a straw man by fundy-lay atheists and skeptics. But there it is. They make these ridiculous arguments against the Bible. And at face value, look, if they could prove there was an expectation, look, you get everything you pray for from the Christian God. There's this phenomenon where God's hidden in the sense of Yeah, I prayed for a red sports car. I did not get a red sports car, therefore God is hidden. Unanswered prayer could be another form of divine hiddenness. Lack of the positive results that you want, lack of religious experiences. Some people have, in the past, have made arguments based on divine hiddenness in the form of a lack of the proper desire. Hey, I believe in God, but I don't desire Him. I should desire Him. Why is God withholding from me and hiding from me these proper desires that I should have? So, as you can see, there are different forms that the phenomenon of divine hiddenness can take. Now, as I said, unfortunately, in the modern world, all these other forms are complete rubbish. Nobody, virtually no atheist in the entire world, tries to argue based on these other forms of divine hiddenness. And you can see why. There's a lot more problems with establishing both of the premises in terms of the incompatibility premise. There's also problems, especially the most problematic is on the empirical level, right? So, for example, with desires, well, what about the differences? Maybe you have a higher order, second order desire. Sometimes we have subconscious desires, and that's a lot more that's psychologically proven that human beings are complex in that way, and it becomes a lot more difficult to prove something like the empirical premise. That element of the argument becomes a lot more difficult. And that's why most atheist philosophers, including J.L. Schellenberg, focus particularly on something that's, at least according to them, apparently more readily easy to available or easier to prove empirically in terms of non-belief, right? And typically, oh, well, somebody reports, look, I seriously lack this propositional belief that God exists. Boom, check mark. On the principle of credulity and the principle of testimony, as Richard Swinburne might say, well, we'll probably believe that they're telling the truth. I don't believe every single person who says they lack belief in God. Are they all lying? We'll get into that. These are issues in the empirical premise that we need to look at. But nonetheless, you see that the lack of belief, at least in principle, is a lot more readily accessible for evaluation. Do I have it or not? Compared to other things that are more complicated, like do I really have a desire for God or not? I know I think I don't, but maybe I do. Maybe I have a higher order desire. Religious experiences, well, what qualifies as religious experiences? So there's a lot more questionable aspects, and that's why atheist philosophers really hone in on non-belief. That's the form of divine hiddenness that everyone uses to try and prove that the argument for God being hidden proves atheism. And obviously inherent in that is this assumption of Schellenberg and others that propositional belief is a necessary component for God to exist and for human beings to exist in a certain way, and we'll get into the more details. Well, necessary for what? But there's this component where belief is necessary. We would expect belief if God existed. So we'll get into the details as to how that works, but I just wanted to mention that there are different forms that divine hiddenness might take on, the best of which we're trying to steelman the best argument for atheism we can here, because this time the shoe's on the other foot. With the cosmological argument, it was the theist's claim. As the theist, I bared the burden of proof. Well, here the shoe's on the other foot with the atheist, and to some degree, obviously I'm a Christian, and I'm going to be, in the end, trying to refute this argument, obviously, because I'm not an atheist. But at least for the sake of argument, I have to put my atheist hat on to some extent, just like Caleb Jackson did when he was evaluating the resurrection and did a great job on, by the way. Now it's my turn. I have to, at least to some extent, put on my atheist cap and try my best to steelman and to be charitable to atheists like Schellenberg in making this argument. So on that front, that's why we're looking at the best form of hiddenness, the one that's most readily accessible and arguably necessary for God's existence in this context, and that is the issue of belief, propositional belief in God's existence. Additionally, just before I get into the next section here, incidentally, Most, if not all, of the criticisms, well, okay, not all, but most of the criticisms, at least the successful ones or the defeaters for the argument of divine hiddenness in the form of non belief or belief versus belief, those also equally apply to any and all other forms of divine hiddenness, desires, lack of religious experiences, lack of answered prayer. The answer or defeaters, virtually most of the defeaters that we're going to be giving against this the belief versus non-belief version of the argument from divine hiddenness apply equally to these other versions or other forms of divine hiddenness as well. So our butts are covered as Christians here, in that even if somebody, an atheist, smart aleck atheist, wants to come up with some new form of atheism based on a lack of desires, a divine hiddenness argument, based on lack of desires or lack of whatever, it doesn't matter, because the defeaters, most of the defeaters we're going to be giving in this show will apply just as equally to them as well and defeat those arguments as well just as easily. So I've covered all the bases here. So yeah, just wanted to mention that. Yeah, let's move on to the next section here, subsection. Now, as I kind of hinted at, there are different versions of the argument from divine hiddenness, and many different subversions and that sort of thing. Just like with any argument for or against God's existence, different philosophers have taken their individual takes at it. And even restricting our focus to non-belief based versions of the divine hiddenness argument, which, as I said, 99% of philosophers today do, there are different strategies or different ways of making these arguments. So, for example, some atheists have adopted strategies that kind of restrict the scope of the type of God they're trying to disprove. So they're not trying to prove atheism per se, but they're trying to prove that this specific God concept or this version of God doesn't exist. And an example of that is the argument by Theodore Drange, who I think I have his paper freely available for you on my blog site. So take a look at that and read it for yourself. But he specifically, no surprise, like all the atheists and skeptics in the world today, it's almost providentially arranged by Satan that they attack the Christian God. They don't know anything about the Muslim God or anything about others. They can only target the true God, the Christian God. And I think Satan's behind that to some extent. But yeah, so Theodore Drange, true to form as an atheist, he specifically targets God as conceived by evangelical Christians. And he says that God doesn't exist based on this phenomenon of non-belief in the Christian God in the world. And he kind of claims evidence against the existence of God, of the Bible, based on the sheer amount of non-belief in the Christian God specifically. Not just about God in general or general theism, but about the Christian God specifically. And essentially the idea is that, look, on evangelical Christianity, God wants everyone, or at least every person who meets his conditions for salvation, to believe that he exists. So it seems very likely that God could do much more, than what he's currently doing to ensure a much greater number of people believe that he exists propositionally. Yet, we have in the world, what we have in the world today is not enough, therefore the Christian God doesn't exist. So that's Theodore Drange's version of the argument. He says there would be far fewer non-believers. Another argument, version of the non-belief based divine hiddenness argument, is that of Stephen Mateson. So he's argued for atheism on the basis of a demographical feature, based on the demographics of non-belief. So, and he says, well, look, there's this weird, unexpected, uneven distribution of non-belief in God. And it just so happens to coincidentally be correlated to which particular parts of the world people live in and what culture they have. So why is it that 95% of the population in Saudi Arabia believes in the Lord our God, or as they call him, the false god Allah, from a Christian perspective? They believe, but they nonetheless, they believe in a general theist concept, right? But if you go to Thailand, it's the opposite. 95% of the peeps there are Buddhists, atheistic Buddhists. So yeah, only 5% are theistic there, and there's this weird demographic correlation around the world. They say, well, that demographic feature of non-belief wouldn't happen if God really existed, therefore God doesn't exist. So that's Stephen Matson's version of the argument. Now, obviously, there have been many responses totally refuting this. Among one of the best are, people like Dr. William Lane Craig. He's given his Molinistic defeater, completely destroying this type of argument of the atheists and skeptics, based on Molinism and God's middle knowledge. Provides an answer, I think, in at least two ways. Well, God knew in advance you wouldn't believe, so he put you in Thailand. Whoever he knew would not believe in God sinfully. He is providentially arranged that they'd be in that part of the world. Okay, that works. That can answer the question and defeat it as well. There's also the answer from sin, that people are culturally influenced unduly by their parents, by their culture, their friends, and that's because of our own sinful nature. So there's that type of explanation as well. Point is, there are many defeaters for this type of argument. It's utterly destroyed, and it's a failure in my opinion. It's very weak as an argument, and that's why we're not going to be focusing on it. But just be aware that there is a demographic version based on non-belief that tries to argue for atheism and says, hey, why is it that non-belief seems to be correlated on the basis of culture? What makes sense of that? There's another type of argument based on non-belief, or based on a lack of a particular type of belief in God, that claims to disprove the existence of God. And this one is by Jason Marsh, the philosopher. And he kind of gives a cognitive science of religion-based approach or aspect. And he argues for what he calls natural non-belief. He says, well, look, ethnographic data about pre-industrial cultures back in the ancient prehistoric times, most of the people didn't believe in God propositionally, not in the way that we modern monotheists do. We know historically that was a development that came quite a bit later on. And they usually have this sequence of events. You have animism, polytheism, then henotheism, and then finally you get to the Abrahamic faith and monotheism proper. And they claim this allegedly proves this natural non-belief, this belief that's just natural within us. The belief in God is not natural or inherent to human beings, as proven by the majority of people in human history not having this belief. We wouldn't expect that if God truly did exist in terms of our monotheistic concepts. This wouldn't be the case. And once again, this is complete rubbish, and I'll include some papers on this. The cognitive science of religion is garbage and rubbish. People like Daniel Dennett argue this way. It's been totally refuted. It's speculative. It relies upon unfalsifiable nonsense premises and assumptions that only an atheist or a skeptic who's biased would believe in the first place. So there are tons of disputes about the facts of belief in God, the notion of development of the belief in God, or development of theism and our concepts of God. Complete bunk and rubbish, and has been disproven time and time again. It didn't exist till 500 BC. Oh, well, shoot, now it's been proven to exist in 1000 BC. Okay, cool. Now we've just got absolute proof of the Exodus. I can't believe this. A new archaeological finding just discovered this year, or back in 2021, and just published in the peer-reviewed archaeological literature this year, proving documentary hypothesis. You are a fool, atheists. You must feel foolish for being so dumb and believing what Richard Carrier and all this nonsense of Francesca Stravonalaku, I butchered her name, sorry, but they make up this horse trash, speculative horse trash, based on a lack of evidence. You've just been destroyed. Absolute proof. We found archaeological things from the time of Joshua. Those curses mentioned on Mount Ebla, I think it is, just based off thing. Yahweh, the name Yahweh existed. This is 3,200 years, 1200 BC. Before that, these things date from. Confirmed. Absolute proof that curse in the name of Yahweh. And this confirms the biblical story about Joshua at that particular mountain, giving curses in the name of Yahweh. Remember, allegedly, the name Yahweh didn't exist later on, because back in 3,200 years ago, there was no concept of the monotheistic God, according to the cognitive science of religion, or at least the previous versions of it. Obviously, they have to keep adapting to fit the facts and stuff like that. But the point is that they have to keep adapting. It's pure speculation, it's pure historical horse trash, and because of this, they can't prove their case. It's very problematic to argue that there is such a thing as natural non-belief. Furthermore, it's actually been proven psychologically that actually natural non-belief doesn't exist. It's natural belief, right? People are inherently born theistic believers, and there's some body of evidence proving this today as a counter. So, well, what do you make sense of this? How do you fit the evidences together? I don't know. I don't care. I'm not going. That's not my project in this episode. That's not the version of the Hiddenness argument I'm interested in. I will include some arguments for the cognitive science of religion from my philosophy of religion class, so you can read a little bit about that and stuff. But it's just interesting. There's an open debate about some of the presumed facts that these people rely on, like Marsh rely on, in order to make this argument that there's, the phenomenon of natural non-belief. No, actually, there's been proven natural belief in God. Now, what are you going to say? So, it's that's a main problem when we come to the empirical premise, right? And that's going to totally refute it. The atheist can't meet his burden of proof to prove his claim in terms of the empirical premise here, and that's why we're not going to focus on this straw man, this weak version of the argument. We're going to look at the best version of the non-belief based divine hiddenness arguments, and I've already hinted at who that is. That's J.L. Schellenberg's argument for divine hiddenness on the basis of what he calls non-resistant non-belief. And I'll get into a second what that's going to be, otherwise known on the basis of what I call real seekers. So I'm kind of modifying J.L. Schellenberg's Divine Hiddenness Argument. My old professor, Class Cray, has kind of adapted his argument, I think strengthened it, and made his version of the premises more clear. I'll play a little clip of Schellenberg talking about his argument, and then have Class Cray give his version. It's Cray's adaptation of Schellenberg's argument I'm using, but I've made my own modifications to help clarify and improve the argument and strengthen, in my opinion, the argument here. So let's go through that let me play those clips, and then I'll go through the argument in premise format. All right, so here I'm going to be playing just two quick clips. So the first one is just about a minute and a half, but this is Dr. J.L. Schellenberg himself on the Closer to Truth series, just giving a very, very brief breakdown of his Hiddenness of God argument.
John, I love talking to atheists because that's the only hope that I have to believe that my desire to believe in God has any substance whatsoever. So what are your best arguments against the existence of God?
Well, there may well be other arguments, but there are three that I would mention in particular. One is the argument from Hiddenness, the Hiddenness argument. Another is the argument from horrors, a certain subclass of evils, the very worst evils. And the third is an argument from free will, which is
just to pause it, so sorry about that. Sorry to interrupt the Hiddenness of God. But this argument from libertarian free will of J.L. Schellenberg, this is another argument for atheism that's very little known. I'm going to be including this in my own Existence of God series eventually, way down the line from now. But I'm going to be addressing this because it's been largely ignored by theists in philosophical literature and that sort of thing. And I know that J.L. Schellenberg is kind of peeved off about it. He thinks his argument for atheism from the existence of libertarian free will. If libertarian free will is true, God does not exist. He's kind of a little bit he's a little angry that this has been ignored. So I'm not going to ignore it. This is an argument that I'm going to be addressing myself, but that's for another day. We're not doing that today. Today, we're just focused on Schellenberg's Hiddenness of God. So with that, I will shut up. Schellenberg, over to you to continue.
A less familiar but still important argument. So let's take those in turn. The Hiddenness argument starts from the fact about the nature of God, or at least the traditional theistic personal God, that God is perfectly loving. And it moves from there in a series of steps. Okay? It goes from the love of God to the idea of the importance of relationship, that a loving God would pursue, or at least be open to relationship with finite persons who are created by God and loved by God. And then it makes the point that for God to really be open like that, people have to be in a position to participate in relationship with God. For that to be the case, they have to be able to believe that God exists. And then you look around and you say, well, there are a lot of people who don't believe in the existence of God who would believe if there were such a being. So that's the rough outline of the Hiddenness argument. The argument.
Okay, so that's it for that. Now I just want to play a little bit more detail, a quick 9 to 10 minute clip of my supervisor and friend, Dr. Klaas Cray. He was on my podcast, Real Seekers, so you can watch the full video. But one of the three topics he addressed when he was on my show was J.L. Schellenberg's version of the Hiddenness of God argument. So he kind of adapts and adopts it and puts it in premise format. So listen to this 10-minute clip or so.
Yeah, sure. So why don't I, if it's all right with you, I'll take a few minutes and just set out an argument with a little bit of preparatory remarks. And then I can talk later on, if you want, about some objections to this argument. Everything in philosophy is controversial, right? Everything in philosophy of religion is controversial, and this kind of argument is no exception. So a little bit of stage setting, right? So thus the so-called problem of divine hiddenness is a bit of a misnomer, right? It makes it sound as though there's a God and this God is hiding, and that's a problem for somebody or someone. Well, that may be so, and it may be a problem, but that's really not what this is about. So this is an argument for atheism. And it's an argument for atheism that the most prominent defender is a Canadian philosopher named J.L. Schellenberg, a terrific philosopher who's been defending it for several decades. And the basic idea is this. Sometimes people argue that certain features of the world count against the existence of God. Okay, that's very general. So, of course, famously, people will say, well, look, here's a feature of the world that counts against the existence of God, evil. If there were a God, God wouldn't allow this evil or that evil or any evil or so much evil or whatever. Okay. The Hiddenness argument is not the problem of evil, but it's similar in that it points to a certain phenomenon in the world and says, hey, this phenomenon counts against the existence of God. So there's a structural similarity. So what's the phenomenon? The phenomenon is non-belief in God. The phenomenon is more particularly reasonable non-belief in God. Schellenberg and others say that, look, if there were a God, there would be a lot less, virtually not at all, in fact, non-belief in God. Okay, so that's the phenomenon that's held to count against the existence of God. Now, that kind of argument can be spelled in a variety of ways. It can be spelled deductively or inductively or abductively. It kind of infants to the best explanation type argument. I'm going to focus here on one version of this argument, which I've adapted a little bit from Schellenberg. So it just is a series of numbered steps, numbered propositions, numbered premises in the argument leading to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. But keep your mental eye on that thought, which is that the phenomenon here is some version of non-belief, and something about that phenomenon is held to show that God doesn't exist. Okay, so here we go. Step one in the argument, well, I've got to move something blocking my ability to read my own slide. There we are. Step one on the argument says, and it's a little bit of a convoluted way if you're not used to reading arguments like this, it says that if no perfectly loving God exists, then God doesn't exist. What that statement or premise or proposition is saying is that it is a necessary condition for something or someone to be God, that being be perfectly loving. To put it a different way, being perfectly loving is an essential attribute of God. Okay, that's the claim in step one of the argument. God exists, God is perfectly loving, or to put it contrary-wise, if no perfectly loving God exists, well, then God doesn't exist. God has to be perfectly loving in order to be God or in order to exist. That's the first claim. Second claim. The second claim states that something about love. If there is a God who is loving, that being is always open to having a personal relationship with each person. Well, maybe not each and every person. Maybe there are some people who, for one reason or another, are incapable of having a relationship with God, but let's sort of set those aside and effectively doing in practice here. Here's the idea. It is part and parcel of being loving, of loving persons, that God would want to have a loving personal relationship with every person. That's what God would want, or what God would be open to. That's what the second step of the argument is saying. The third step of the argument is trying to articulate what would be required for such a relationship to occur. Now, it's very important before I get into this that I clarify something. This argument has been misinterpreted all sorts of ways, as Schellenberg knows all too well. Schellenberg is not saying that God would somehow want to force a relationship with each and every person. Okay, Schellenberg is not saying that. Schellenberg is saying, however, that if there were a loving God, that God would want to have a personal relationship with everyone. And what such a God would do would be to make sure that such a relationship is at least possible. God would want to do what is minimally required for each and every person to be in a relationship with God. Okay, what's minimally required to be in a relationship with someone? Well, you've got to believe that that person exists. So this is how we get to step 3. If there's a God who's always open to a personal relationship with everyone who's capable of it, then no such person fails to believe that God exists. Okay? In other words, everyone would believe that God exists, because you can't be, Schellenberg thinks, in a personal relationship with God unless at the very least you believe that God exists. Okay? I couldn't be in a personal relationship with my wife if I failed to believe that this being exists, right? Suppose I'm struck on the head and I have amnesia or something like that, right? I couldn't be in this kind of relationship with my wife if I somehow failed to believe that she exists. So in order for a relationship to be possible, Schellenberg says, God is going to ensure that everyone believes that God exists. A couple of caveats. There might be people who are blameworthy for not believing that God exists, so let's set those aside. Maybe there are people like that. But let's say this, no one would, through no fault of their own, fail to believe that God exists. That's what the word blamelessly is doing in step 3 of the argument. Okay, so let's compress things a little bit. We can basically combine step 2 and step 3 into this. If a perfectly loving God exists, then nobody ever blamelessly fails to believe that God exists. So that's the expectation. If theism is true, God exists, God is perfectly loving, then everyone, or just about everyone, should believe that God exists. Why? Because that's a minimal precondition for being in a relationship with God. And that's what God wants. Why, as a little aside, why does God want that? Well, Schellenberg said, look what theists commonly say. Theists commonly say that being in a certain kind of relationship with God is the greatest good for beings, that it would be an ultimate good, that it would be a supremely wonderful thing for beings to be in a relationship with their Creator. So that's what God wants. Part of love is wanting the best for the people we love. So if what is best for us is that we be in a relationship with God, then God wants that. God's not going to force it, but God's going to put the minimum conditions in place. And the minimum conditions involve belief. Widespread, almost universal belief that God exists. But guess what? There isn't widespread, near universal belief that God exists. There are people who are perfectly capable of having a relationship with God who don't believe that God exists. And they don't believe it through no fault of their own. Okay, so step 5 is an empirical claim about the world. This is the recalcitrant data, the data that counts against theism, according to Schellenberg. The existence of reasonable unbelievers. Okay? Theists, it includes religious people who are non-theistic and non-religious people as well. I think Schellenberg would say of all the people who lived and walked the earth, human persons who lived and walked the earth, before theism was even a going concern, right? Before Judaism, before Christianity, before Islam, before any other theistic religion, there were an awful lot of people who lived and walked the earth. Those people, through no fault of their own, failed to believe that God exists. And that, Schellenberg said, is not what you should expect if theism is true. So 5 is the empirical evidence that counts against theism, according to this argument. So, pulling together together step 4 and step 5. Step 4 says, look, if you have a God, if God were to exist, you'd expect this. But step 5, you don't get this. Therefore, step 6, there is no perfectly loving God. And of course, we pointed out, or the argument pointed out in step 1, that being perfectly loving is a necessary condition, an essential attribute for God. Well, so if a perfectly loving God doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist, because God, in order to be God, in order to be unsurpassable being, is supposed to be perfectly loving.
All right. So yeah, that's Class Cray's version of the argument. That it's heavy influence on the version we're going to be looking at in this show for the most part. And yeah, I think he cut it around premise number 5. This is where, as we'll find out, Schellenberg, these people are specifically non-resistant to a personal relationship. So they are not non-resistant non-believers, as J.L. Schellenberg calls them. Or in our argument, we're going to be calling them, in addition to that, or what I call real seekers. No real seekers can blamelessly fail to believe that God exists. That said, I just wanted to play these 2 clips. So yeah, I'll turn it over. If you're interested, J.L. Schellenberg has other great videos. So he has a 5-part series detailing the hiddenness of God and going over objections to it, or you can see Class Cray goes over some objections, and it follows some of the framework of the objections we're going to be going over in this show that you're listening to of mine. But yeah, that's for further research. I'll put the links up there for you guys for these 2 YouTube things. But otherwise, yeah, we should be, that should be it for the clips. Now back to the main recording to look at our version of the Hiddenness of God argument as modified from Class Cray's and J.L. Schellenberg's work. Our version of the Hiddenness of God argument here, again, like I said, it's based on the adaptation by Class Cray. So like that, and like Schellenberg's argument, I'm going to be giving, like Cray's version, I want to give a deductive rather than an inductive argument. And I know that sometimes Schellenberg and that sort of thing, they make inductive versions. They just try to say that the conclusion, probably God doesn't exist. I'm not going to engage with that because we're assigning subjective probability values to the truth of each of the premises anyways. So I'm making the full-fledged deductive argument. I prefer deductive arguments. It guarantees the truth of the conclusion if the argument is valid overall, which we'll find out it is going to be a logically valid argument, at least the way we've constructed it. So yeah, we're giving a deductive version. So there's 2 elements there. Is the argument valid, meaning that's the logical structure of the argument. Given the truth of the premises, assuming the premises are true, do the sub-conclusions and conclusion necessarily follow from the assumed truth of those premises? If yes, it's valid. If no, it's invalid. Okay, given that it's valid and it commits no formal nor informal fallacies, then we ask, well, are the premises sound? Are the premises true or not? Or rather, what we're going to be looking at is, are the premises what Richard Feldman calls deductively strong? Right? So that's where our subjective probabilities come in. What's the degree of warrant we have in thinking premise 1 is true or premise 3 is true? And you'll see what we do with that mathematically when we get the final total. Overall, if the total, when we multiply all those probabilities together, is over 50%, well, then the argument has been proven to be true on a balance of probabilities to whatever degree we get. So that's how we're going to be doing this. So what are the premises in standard form of our version of the Divine Hiddenness of Argument based on Class Cray's adaptation of J.L. Schellenberg's version from non-resistant non-belief? So, premise 1, if God exists, then he is a real maximally great being, and or just maximally great being for short. This is as defined by the God final hypothesis elsewhere in this book, I say, or as I've defined him elsewhere. Obviously, because we're going out of order, I haven't made my cumulative case. I haven't argued for the God final hypothesis, so I haven't defined him, or even defined him as a real maximally great being yet. If you're just looking at my cosmological argument, all I argued for there was the God one hypothesis. I haven't done the work. So I'm kind of, in premise one, I'm kind of assuming in advance, based on what I've done privately, that I've already established that God exists as a real maximally great being, minimally. And that's what the God final hypothesis is. Minimally, that's what he is. So obviously that's premise one. Then we have premise two. Well, if one is a real maximally great being, as per the God final hypothesis, then one must, among other attributes, be perfectly loving. And then I have in brackets qualifying in the ordinary sense of the word as generally understood by human beings, to the maximal compossible degree. And that last bit is key, so make sure you take note of that. Okay, so this leads to our first sub-argument. Our sub-conclusion, or premise 3 in the main argument, is therefore, if God exists, then he must, among other attributes, be perfectly loving in the ordinary sense of the word as generally understood by humans, to the maximal compossible degree. And this is a sub-conclusion. It's obviously true because if the premises are true, this is a logically valid argument pattern form known as hypothetical syllogism, which basically goes if P then Q, if premise 2, if Q then R, therefore if P then R. So everyone admits this. So yeah, this just follows necessarily from the truth of premises 1 and 2. And we'll get into our assessment, are they true or not, later. Then we have premise 4. So this is the reverse, right? So premise 4 is, well, if God is not perfectly loving then, in the ordinary sense as defined by, generally understood by humans, to the maximal compossible degree, and by maximal compossible degree, it's just saying to the maximal degree that it's logically or metaphysically possible for a being to possess that property, in conjunction with its other maximally great being properties. Okay, so if God is not perfectly loving in this way, then God does not exist. So it's just the reverse of premise 3, stated in negative terms, and that follows a logically valid pattern known as contraposition. So that's proven true. Premise 5 then, now we're starting to get into Schellenberg stuff. So if God exists and is, among other attributes, perfectly loving in the way I've defined, to the maximal compossible degree, then God is quote-unquote open to reciprocal, positively meaningful conscious relationships, or to keep it short, to meaningful conscious relationships with any and all what Schellenberg calls non-resistant non-believers, who are, 1, not resisting God, and 2, capable of such a relationship with God, and finally 3, in a position to participate in such a relationship. So that's Schellenberg's argument. And when we get to the assessment, I've modified this premise. I said, or alternatively, they're at least, minimally speaking, what I call a real seeker. Because when it comes to non-resistant non-believers, I wanted to include this in because I wanted people to see how I'm using Schellenberg's argument. But really, it doesn't have to be a non-resistant non-believer. That's going to be a problematic, controversial concept. It's too much. So in order to steelman the atheist while still being charitable, so I included this non-resistant non-believer, but I said that, or you could just be what I call a real seeker. So yeah, God, all this premise is saying is, look, if God exists and he's perfectly loving, he's going to be open to having meaningful conscious relationships with any and all either non-resistant non-believers, or at least minimally any and all real seekers as I define them. And we'll get into that in a moment. Great. Premise 6. Well, if God is indeed open to having these reciprocal, positively meaningful conscious relationships with any and all non-resistant non-believers, or real seekers, well, then it's got to be true that no such person would ever blamelessly fail to consciously believe propositionally that God exists at any given time in human history or at any time in one's life, unless God had or has a sufficient reason for permitting it that was morally, theologically, and otherwise consistent with his divine nature. So essentially, premise 6 here, this is the premise that states that conscious propositional belief in God's existence is logically, or at least is necessary in one way or another, in order for one to have these meaningful relationships with God. So this is the necessity premise. This is the premise that states belief, propositional belief in God's existence. You need that if you're going to have, for what purpose? Need it for what? In order to have this meaningful relationship with God. Okay, great. So from that, we now get a sub-conclusion, or second sub-conclusion, otherwise known as premise 7 in the main argument. It says, look, therefore, if God exists and is perfectly loving, then minimally no non-resistant non-believers or real seekers would ever blamelessly fail to consciously believe the proposition that God exists at any given time, unless there was reason for God to permit it consistent with his divine nature. So there we are. That's premise 7. And notice that premise 7, or this sub-conclusion 2, this represents, remember that fundamental 2-premise underlying structure? We had the incompatibility premise, and then we had the empirical evidential premise. Premise 7 here, or this sub-conclusion 2, this represents the incompatibility premise, right? It gives that conditional. If God exists as you define as being perfectly loving, then you will not find this form of divine hiddenness in the form of non-resistant non-believers or real seekers blamelessly failing to have a propositional belief that God exists at a given time. So this is true from the hypothetical syllogism argument pattern. So there you go. So now getting into premise 8. And this is going to be the final proper premise of the argument. This represents the empirical or evidential premise. Remember that 2-premise underlying structure. And this says, well, at some times in human history, there have been and or currently are non-resistant non-believers or real seekers, minimally real seekers, who do blamelessly fail to consciously believe the proposition that God exists. And further, it's also a fact that there are no sufficient reasons for God permitting this that are consistent with his divine nature. So this is the factual premise. So the incompatibility premise says, if this condition obtains, that's incompatible with the existence of God. Then premise 8, the empirical premise says, well, it's an empirical fact of the world that there are these this factor does obtain, non-belief does occur. Therefore, through both of these premises, we know that there's an incompatibility there, right? Therefore, God can't be perfectly loving in the ordinary sense because there are real seekers that fail this. And then that leads to our main conclusion, which is logically equivalent, that, well, therefore, God himself does not exist. In other words, in context of our book here, or our existence of God series, i.e., God doesn't exist. Okay, what I really mean is the God final hypothesis is false. And I haven't stated that in terms of the God final hypothesis in the premises, but you can easily just modify it, or maybe I'll modify it before I post it up or something like that. But, just instead of saying God doesn't exist and talking about God, you can say, well, the God final hypothesis is false, and insert that into the premises and stuff like that. It's all the same thing. So that's the main argument in premise format. We'll go over, there's a lot of key terms and technical jargon here, so we'll go over that as we go over our assessment of each of the premises. Okay, so as we can obviously see here, this argument is logically valid in all of its sub-conclusions and in terms of the main argument as a whole. It employs well-known logically valid argument patterns that everybody knows, hypothetical syllogism, for example, contraposition, stuff like that, modus tollens. And so with that said, it is a logically valid argument. Also, in terms of logical fallacies, this argument commits no formal nor informal logical fallacies, and therefore it works. So the question, it all comes down to, well, are the premises true? In other words, are the premises logically sound as well? Or, as is more technically precise here, are the premises deductively strong? Are we rational, or in terms of my epistemic criterion, I don't go by justification, are we warranted in the Alvin Plantinga sense in believing that all of the premises, individually and combined, are probably true on a balance of probabilities? That's what we're going to be looking to aim to see if this argument is a success or not. Let's get into that. Let's get into the assessment of the deductive strength and or the stronger component of soundness or truthfulness of the each of the premises and subconclusions in this argument. All right, let's start with premise 1. Okay, so in terms of assessing the first premise, if God exists, then he is a real maximally great being, as defined by the God final hypothesis, as we define elsewhere, supposedly. We haven't done so, but we will eventually in this God series, Existence of God series. So what does this mean? So by using the term God, it's important to note that Dr. J.L. Schellenberg, he provides his own definition, right? So he says, look, by God, we refer to the traditional Western philosophical concept of God as understood in Western philosophy over the centuries. In other words, a quote-unquote separate but potentially infinite consciousness, a personal and perfect creator of the universe who is unsurpassably rich and wondrous. That's Schellenberg's definition in his papers. Again, all three of them will be available for free on my blog site for you. But this understanding of the term, it's more or less consistent with our term. That's a consistent with being a real maximally great being, or consistent with what we call the God final hypothesis. So remember, Dr. Alvin Plantinga and Eugen Nagasawa define a maximally great, or at least a real maximally great being, as a being that essentially has all of the great-making properties or attributes to the maximal possible degree. You know, the maximum degree you can have in relation to all the other properties combined. And I've added a qualification here by just saying, to be consistent with the God final hypothesis, it's not that he has all the great-making properties, but he at least has all of the provable great-making properties from our cumulative case God argument, where we get all of the arguments, all of the attributes we can prove in terms of the God final hypothesis. So that may be equal to, or may be that there are less great-making properties that we can prove. We can't prove all of the great-making properties that God has. So the God final hypothesis would just include all of the provable ones. However, if we can prove, and through the modal ontological argument, I would argue we can prove that God has all of the great-making properties, that's provable, and great. The God final hypothesis is equivalent to what Eugen Nagasawa calls a real maximally great being then. This just follows. I mean, this premise is automatically true just from a conceptual analysis of what God is supposed to be, traditionally speaking. And this is the concept of God that we are evaluating and that sort of thing. In terms of, it's automatically true for us, for our purposes, in my Existence of God series, we are assuming, again, I haven't gotten there yet. I've just proven the God 1 hypothesis so far. But if I did complete all of my positive case first before going out of order and coming to the Hiddenness of God, we would have found out that the God final hypothesis is in fact a real maximally great being. So I'm just assuming that for the sake of argument here. So therefore, we have to assume this premise is 100% proven true just for the sake of argument alone for our purposes, because we are evaluating our positive case proved that God is a real maximally great being. So that's what this argument is meant to falsify. And it follows from J.L. Schellenberg's argument that this is the concept of God that is really at stake. This is what's meant by the traditional Western understanding of God, and it's an unsurpassable, as Schellenberg says, being in terms of all his riches and wonders, wondrous nature and that sort of thing. Now, there is one thing I should mention here. So, there are a couple of objections to this. Oh, sorry. And before we go on, as more warrant, as Bible believing Christian theists, even more so, we have absolute biblical warrant for believing that God is a real maximally great being. Yes, it doesn't explicitly use this, but it ascribes to God all of the great making properties to their maximal, in a loose sense, infinite, potentially infinite degree. And the Bible does describe God like this. So this is absolutely consistent with what the Bible says. And if you're a Bible believing Christian, 100% proven true for this premise. You cannot deny it. Now, that said, there are some theists that might try to deny this. They'll say, well, we believe in God, but God is not a real maximally great being or even consistent with your God final hypothesis. So, for example, you have alleged theists like David Kemble Cook, who they believe in a diminished, quasi great being conception of God, one that's not omnipotent, or one that's not omniscient, or one that's not morally perfect. It has some kind of deficiency, either by lacking an entire one or more properties, great making properties, or by having a diminishment in the degree. It doesn't hold, it has all of the great making properties, but it holds one or more of them in a degree that is less than the maximal compossible degree. That's what philosophers call a quasi great being. So if you believe in that, if you're an open theist or something like that, you don't think God knows the future, so he's not omniscient, or you have some quasi diminished understanding of God, then yeah, you would reject premise number one. But again, that just misses the point. Who cares? We don't. Schellenberg, no atheist cares about these diminished concepts of God. The argument's simply not aimed at addressing those. It is aimed at addressing the traditional concepts, the real maximally great being versions of God. That's all the argument goes. So theists that deny that are just out to lunch. They're attacking a straw man. The hiddenness of God argument doesn't even attempt or claim to address their versions of God, at least so long as their version of God denies one of the essential properties in this argument. If it denies God's omnipotence or maximal powers or moral perfection or that he's perfectly loving, or if it denies that he's omniscient perhaps, these are the main properties that are at play in the hiddenness of God argument. Obviously, if your conception of God has all of those the relevant properties, but is missing some irrelevant property, well, then the hiddenness of God argument will apply to that conception of God. So it all just depends on, well, what is your conception of God? What is the quasi-great being you have in mind? And then we'll see if this argument applies or not. But for our purposes, it's absolutely irrelevant. We cannot go with the quasi-great being argument, and we cannot go there in truth. I mean, as Bible-believing Christian theists, we have to accept this 100% proven true. There's another type of objection from theists, though, and even Christian theists. You say? Well, we've been kind of assuming a realist perspective, for lack of a better word, whereas one atheist philosopher, John R. Shook, puts a fundamentalist understanding of the concept of God, whereby we have a realist understanding. God equals a real maximally great being. These propositions are expressed in sentences, and these represent reality. They correspond to reality. The correspondence theory of truth applies to it. There are certain alleged theists and Christians who would deny this. They take more mystical views, and they don't take propositions or sentences and language in the way that normal people do, right? So under this, the atheist John R. Shook outlines about 4 different mystical conceptions of God. And he calls this in the category of theology into the mist. And it might be that proponents of these type of concepts of God, these guys don't value knowledge, logic, and rationality like most normal people do, and like people should, in my opinion. So maybe if you take one of these mystical views of God, then you can deny the truth of premise one. So let's take a look at what are these four different versions of mysticism and mystical conceptions of God. So there is what Schuck calls the first level here, into the mist level 1. And this is the view that, look, any and all religious beliefs, including religious beliefs about God, so for example, take the proposition God is a real maximally great being, as our premise 1 says. Well, we should not attempt to accurately describe the way that God objectively is. This proposition that we have here cannot be true or false. That's what these mystics say. They say, look, your religious beliefs about God are just infused with human thinking. And at best, all this, God is a real maximally great being, all that can be used for is just be used symbolically, metaphorically, or as some kind of inspirational poetry, and or even they say outdated mythology type understanding. And usually they say, well, that's just your understanding based on your culture's predominant religion and understanding of God. So the way Schuck illustrates this is, look, under into the mysticism level 1 type thing that says these things are neither true nor false. Under this, fundamentalism, a realist understanding is, look, I see the light directly through divine revelation or arguments. I see God, and I directly know he's a real maximally great being. Yup, absolutely true. This first level of mysticism says, no, you don't actually see the light. You don't see God or understand God directly. Rather, you're seeing the light by reflection in a mirror. And this mirror has distortions based on your predominant cultural religion and stuff like that. So it's distorted. And this changes the image. So when you say God's a real maximally great being, the real maximally great being is a distortion in your understanding. So that's how these guys understand things. Then there's a second, higher level of mysticism that Schuck calls into the mist level 2. This is where a religious belief about God should not consider him to be an objectively existing thing or being at all. Forget about describing God. God isn't even a thing out there. There's nothing out there. God, for these guys, God just exists differently altogether than the way other things exist, like my pen or desk or something external to me. God is not an object for these people. So the way these mystics try to describe that is they say, look, God lacks all modes of contrast between God and other things. So you have to strip away all of God's qualities, all of God's relations, both to other objects external to himself, but also even within himself, between his own attributes and properties and that sort of thing. So semi-related to existentialism, that's more the next level, but existentialism helps us to understand, well, what is the stripping away process? What do you mean by you have to strip away all modes of contrast between the object and subject? You have to strip away dichotomies between internal experience and external reality by itself. So really they see God, he's just really the ultimate mode of existence, kind of like a Thomas Aquinas type thing. God is being itself. God is existence. And this is kind of reflected in other Eastern religions and that sort of thing. He's said to be the ultimate. He has all and or none of the unlimited qualities or relations. So yeah, another way of picturing it under this level, God is identified sometimes as a personal religious experience of some sort, or God might be identified as some sort of religious universal relationship in some way. So Schuck illustrates this. He says, look, for these level 2 mystics, the way they see God is kind of like, well, look, you see the light via refraction. You see God through light refraction. So you can't see the original pure light, but you see it through a prism. So you only see the colored lights through a prism. You see God through this prism. You don't see the light of him directly or nor even reflected like in a mirror. You just see it through this prism. And again, that prism is usually taken to be symbolism of your culture's predominant religion. And that's all this God is a real maximally great being. That's just symbolism from your Western culture, Dale. It's meaningless, blah, blah. That's not God at all. God is really just some mode of being or a relation or some way he represents unlimited qualities and properties or something. Okay, the third level of mystics say that, well, look, religious beliefs about God, they should not presume to fully adequately conceive of God. So here we're going beyond just what do we do with propositions like God is a real maximally great being. Now we're saying that our very concepts themselves do not apply to God, at least partially don't apply to God. So, general human concepts like God is loving, love itself, what we understand as human beings, love. So you can see how this relates to and will relate to future premise 2 below, right? Love, justice, even our concepts or conceptions themselves don't necessarily have any application to God. So this is the next level of, I would say, craziness, but others would say into the mist or mysticism and that sort of thing. So under this view, look, religious beliefs, once again, they apply symbolism from many, but this time from any and all religions. It's not just influenced by your culture's dominant religion. They apply these equally, right? So this is where someone like John Hick fits in with a religious pluralist understanding or an existentialist understanding. And under this view, really, you only see the light through a filter. So the light is dispersed into colored lights, like with the prism, but even these colored lights are covered by a filter themselves. So you neither see directly the original pure light nor the colored light itself. That's analogous. You don't see God. Again, you don't even see God through a prism. Instead, you see that through a prism with a filter on top. So it's another layer of hiddenness in terms of seeing God directly or understanding God as a human being. Finally, we have full-fledged mysticism. This is what Into the Mist level 4, according to John R. Shuck. And this is, look, human conceptions do not apply to God at all in any way, not even in a partial degree. And this represents God as being totally stripped of all human knowable propositional and conceptual content. So he is entirely beyond us, entirely mysterious. Our belief in God, it's no more, is more than just, it's more than just this, right? It's some people recognize qualities or things that are there. When you have a proposition, God is a real maximally great being, or God is love, or whatever it is, there's more to that statement than just the propositional or conceptual resources. According to these mystics, there's something mysterious beyond it. That's what's God. Take away the propositional content, take away and strip out the conceptual content. God's what's left, that mysterious little extra tidbit in the proposition. Again, it doesn't make sense. These guys are nutballs to me, but I'm just trying to explain how Shuck describes these mystical understanding, right? So you'll get some nonsense. So sometimes mystics, full-fledged mystics, will just describe God in terms of the noumenal world, or as opposed to the phenomenal world, like Kant. They'll say, look, God can only be described in negative terms. God is not love. God is not a human. God is not this, not that. Or there's another category where you'll get like inconsistent, contradictory, like Eastern religions saying, well, God is, he's beyond all human categories of understanding. He's beyond personal or impersonal. Yes, that's logically contradiction, but he's beyond the laws of logic and contradiction versus not contradictory. He's beyond all human categories. So it's, he's beyond logical versus illogical, stuff like this. So yeah, religious beliefs and experiences of God are totally irrelevant in this category. And instead, one is kind of unified with God via a mystical experience. And that's to be contrasted with a religious experience. With these full-fledged mystics, into the mist level 4, according to John Shook, the atheist philosopher here, full-fledged mystics are kind of weird, right? They don't believe that there are religious experiences. Religions are irrelevant. They don't care about religious symbols at all. You are beyond that in all earthly mundane categories. So you have a mystical experience, not a religious experience. It's non-religious in nature. So interestingly, we've actually come full circle. With full-fledged mystics, they say that we are directly seeing the pure white light directly again, just like with the realists and fundamentalists, like the way we are as Bible-believing Christians. But here's where these guys become damnable heretics, because they say, well, you don't just directly observe the light as though it's all external relations break down. You are the light. You become unified with God, with the light. And you are transformed radically by it. So these guys say, look, you are God at that point. So that's the different levels of mysticism as John Shook has them, and how they would kind of, so you can kind of see, well, how these guys would kind of interpret our premise 1 and say that it's totally misguided to take that premise in a realist sense. All I'm going to say is these mystics are nutballs. We do not believe in mysticism. We are rational, logical human beings, and most atheists try to argue like that. So I think we can just dismiss these understandings as not being proper. I don't have the resources to kind of. There are John Shook provides great refutations of each of these 4 mystical type positions. Again, I don't want to get into that in this show. I think that's kind of like outside our scope. We're evaluating logically and presuming rational, logical, propositional, and conceptual content of human beings is relevant to religious beliefs about God. But I just wanted to mention that this is a possible escape route that even some alleged Christians might try to take, and you might have to deal with this. And again, I'm not going to do this. So here, we're just going to assume, look, 100% proven that this premise is true. Given our task in this book, we're assuming God is a real maximally great being. Okay, premise number 2. So if one is a real maximally great being, then one must be, among other attributes, perfectly loving, in the ordinary sense of the word as generally understood by humans, to the maximal compossible degree. Great. So in terms of the maximal compossible degree, I already defined that. That's what philosophers say. It has to be to the maximal degree logically or metaphysically possible in light of your other properties and or facts about the external facts about the world. In God's case, there might not be a world because creation is contingent. So in relation to his other divine properties, it has to be the maximal compossible degree of lovingness, and that's perfection. But also notice, look, in the ordinary sense of the word as generally understood by humans, those mystics, at least level 3 and level 4, they might give us a little bit of difficulty here and say your human understanding of love, no application to God at all. And that's going to work against atheists potentially. So let's get into that in a second here. So first of all, how does Schellenberg go about trying to defend this premise? So in the first place, Schellenberg defends perfectly loving, and he spells out precisely what he means by this. And he does so in one of his papers that'll be on my blog site for you guys through an analogical argument, an argument from analogy. He says, look, the way God is perfectly loving is exactly the same way a mom is said to be perfectly loving of her little child. So he uses the analogy of a mother's love for her little kid. And to that end, Schellenberg has argued that there are at least about 5 features that a mother's love for her child exhibits that are directly analogous to God's love for a human being. And this represents what human beings ordinarily mean by the word loving, generally speaking. So the first refers to the fact that a loving mother would consider each of her child's requests and seek to provide a quick response, or at least a response as quickly as possible to do so. That last bit's my own qualification. I'm helping to steelman Schellenberg's argument. Secondly, a loving mother would want to spare her child from experiencing any and all needless trauma, and or at least foster her child's physical, emotional, and, as Christians here, spiritual well-being. Thirdly, a loving mother would want to avoid fostering false or misleading beliefs about her and her relationship with her child, within her child. You doesn't want your kid to have false beliefs about either her or their relationship. Fourthly, a loving mother would want personal interaction with her child whenever possible. And finally, fifth, a loving mother would miss her child if he is separated from her. So those are the 5 conditions for being a loving mother that Schellenberg says these are directly analogous to the Lord our God and us as his children. He's the Heavenly Father, we're the little kiddies. So basically that's the next step of Schellenberg's main argument from analogy here, is to demonstrate that while these loving mother examples and these 5 conditions for a mother being loving toward her child are exactly analogous to God. So in the first place, Schellenberg says that the connection is pretty easy to see, especially for the traditional concept of God as a unsurpassably or real, maximally loving and caring being. He would have all 5 of these general conditions, right? So a perfectly loving God would seriously consider each submitted request through prayer of all of his human creatures, or at the very least of all of his real seekers or non-resistant, non-believer human creatures. And he would seek to provide a quick response, or at least respond as quickly as possible. That qualification is mine, not Schellenberg's. I'm strengthening and steelmanning his atheist argument here. Secondly, a perfectly loving God would want to spare his children from experiencing any and all needless trauma and foster their physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being. Check. You bet. As Bible-believing Christians, you better believe that. Thirdly, a perfectly loving God would want to avoid fostering false or misleading beliefs about him and the relationship between God and his children, or the human beings, these real seekers. Check. You better believe that, Bible-believing Christians. Absolutely. Fourthly, a perfectly loving God would want personal interaction with as many of his children as possible. Check. Finally, a perfectly loving God would miss his children if he is ever separated from them. Check. That's in the Bible. God desires everyone to be saved. He wants to relate to everybody. He loves everyone. So check on all these 5 conditions. We have to agree. As general theists, just generally, in terms of what the inherent concept of being loving in these 5 ways represents, yeah, they do apply to God. And especially as Bible-believing Christians, we've got Bible, divinely inspired scripture attesting to all of these things. So yeah, we have to note these are perfectly analogous. Now, obviously, someone is going to object to this premise if they want to and say, well, actually, there's relevant disanalogies, right? So one might say in the first place, look, this is totally disanalogous. God's not a human being. He's not physical. He's spiritual. He's not a biological female. He's a he. He's a male and stuff like that. Stuff of this nature. Now, these are totally irrelevant. They have no... When you're giving an argument from analogy, and you try to say, well, this is an argument for a false analogy, you have to point out to not just any old disanalogy, like funny-like atheists and skeptics like to do, but actually a relevant disanalogy, a disanalogy that breaks and destroys the relevant analogical relationship. And I don't think there's anything on that front in terms of these obvious disanalogies, like, well, God's spiritual, he's not physical. Yeah, who cares? Irrelevant. The point is there are conceptual constraints in terms of these 5 conditions on what it means to be loving, whether or not you're human or perfect or God or spiritual or physical, irrelevant. Now, outside of that, there may be other disanalogies. But just before I get into that, because I got a little ahead of myself, so how does Schellenberg and others, how do we establish the truth of this premise? So as I said, it follows conceptually based on what love is, and in terms of these five constraints, conceptual constraints, and what a real maximally great being is. We've conceded God's a real maximally great being. He has all the great making properties, being perfectly loving in the five ways specified by Schellenberg is a great making property. So therefore, he must possess it to the maximal possible degree. We can argue that way. That's just obvious. Another way, as a real maximally great being, that would be a morally perfect being. We can argue it is a moral perfection to be perfectly loving in the five ways specified by Schellenberg's argument from analogy. So it follows there. Schellenberg himself, he argues for the truth of this premise on the basis of what he calls ultimism. So that's the proposition that there is a reality that is ultimate in three ways. Number one, a metaphysically ultimate reality. So Schellenberg says, quote unquote, is something whose existence is ultimate or the most fundamental fact about the nature of things. Secondly, is axiologically ultimate. So the ultimate valuable, or the deepest possible value represented here. So you can see how being perfectly loving would represent an axiological ultimate and soteriologically ultimate reality as well. It's a reality in relation to which the deepest or ultimate human good or purpose can be attained. So yeah, basically the idea of a personal reality that is triply ultimate in these three ways specified. Schellenberg says the idea of God in Western philosophy is the idea of the greatest possible person. And all else being equal, a person perfect in love would be an improvement over a person that was not perfect in love. They would be axiologically better if they were the Lord our God in all these ultimate ways plus perfectly loving, compared to ultimate in all three ways but not perfectly loving. That would be in metaphysical, axiological, and soteriological diminishment. Therefore, he wouldn't be the real maximally great being. So that's how Schellenberg argues there. He wouldn't be, as Schellenberg says, he wouldn't be unsurpassable. Obviously, I'm using the term he wouldn't be a real maximally great being to be consistent with our arguments. Now, going back to, okay, so the objectors to this premise, I mentioned the mystics, we're just kind of dismissing them. We're assuming a realist perspective and a traditional concept of God for our purposes in this book, and I think that the realist understanding is perfectly defensible. The versions of mysticism are easily refuted in terms of their conceptions of God. They're unintelligible and logically contradictory, therefore logically impossible to be true. Secondly, we've dismissed irrelevant disanalogies. But I hinted that, okay, well, what might be a relevant disanalogy? And some philosophers have tried to say, well, there is at least one. Look, you're saying God is like a loving mummy with a little kitty. That's not God. No Christian theist believes that. God the Father, not God the mummy, right? And fathers, at least traditionally, are not loving. They're benevolent. They're not the loving and caring, oh, I want to be with my kitty all the time. No, they go to work. They're the breadwinners. They go out and they're benevolent. They are firm. If the child gets out of line, they give the discipline. So a father figure, God is a father figure. He is distant but benevolent in his rulership over the family. The loving and caring mummy figure, that's not analogous to God. So this is a potentially relevant disanalogy here. So what do we say as supporting the atheists, and what does Schellenberg say? I fully agree with Schellenberg. I think that this kind of appeal to a disanalogy is totally fallacious and biblically speaking fallacious as well. So in the first place, Schellenberg says, well, look, comparing it to a distant yet absent father figure, this is just based on a fallacious appeal to common practice. That's a logical fallacy. Look, maybe just because in the past we had this stupid cultural false notion of what a father is, and he's distant, he's firm, he's not the lovey-dovey mummy type figure. This is complete rubbish. This is just an appeal to common practice, and I fully agree with Schellenberg. And I think it's unbiblical too. I mean, in the first place, God is not the Father. God is an Abba, a daddy, a loving and caring daddy. And it's stupid to ascribe, oh, well, being loving and caring, that's a woman's property. That's a attribute of a female. And being benevolent, that's the male thing. This is sexist bullshit. I'm sorry. I am nothing. I'm not a leftist. I'm not an SJW. I don't care for feminazis and all this stuff. But I do have to. If you're appealing to this disanalogy, this is sexist in the literal sense of the word, right? So I will support leftists on this. Or you can't be sexist in this way. So in the being loving, males can be loving. Father figure, daddies can be loving and caring just as much as a woman. Women can be just as benevolent as a father figure can or a male figure can. So I don't subscribe to this, oh, properties belong to certain sexes and stuff like that. Sure, there are generalizations where different sexes have certain properties, but to assume that this applies to God in the same way as our culture has kind of adopted as a common practice is ridiculous. And in fact, the Bible says the opposite, that there are traditionally or culturally feminine properties. I mean, the Bible compares God to like a mother hen wanting to gather up Israel as chicks under her wings and stuff like that. So I don't think it's quite as straightforward as we want it to say, as this disanalogy wants to say here. Clearly, God is a male. I'm sorry, feminazis. He uses the he. That's his pronoun. He was incarnated as a male. It is clear God is a father. He is a man. But just because that's the case, that doesn't preclude the fact that he can be just as loving and caring as the mother figure with her little kitty out in the park or something like that. So I fully agree with Schellenberg's case. I just think it's outdated. It's a weak and fallacious appeal to common practice that people appeal to this disanalogy. And it's, as Bible-believing Christians, I think we have to reject it as well. Even if we do obviously affirm and agree wholeheartedly that, yeah, God is the Father, not God the Mother. Sorry. We can't have these feminazi revisionist arguments. But again, nothing about that prohibits God from being loving and caring and having properties. All properties come from God. God's a deity, right? So God is loving, God is caring, and that's why we as human beings can be loving and caring. So yeah, I just think that misses the boat. So I think that's it. So Schellenberg, yeah, he just says, look, this kind of conception of God as the father figure, distant and absent but benevolent, this just is constrained by traditional culture and has no bearing on the truth of God as a real maximally great being. And we need to free ourselves of these assumptions and go back to, I fully agree, go back to the biblical view of who God is. He reveals to us perfectly who he is. And trust me, loving and caring in the 5 ways prescribed by Schellenberg, absolutely. Biblical check marks all around on that front. So yeah, I think that's it. So what do we say? Look, we have to say 100% proven true for premise 2. Based on secular grounds, yeah, if God is real maximally great being, real maximally great beings must be perfectly loving to the maximal degree possible. And we have secular grounds and biblical warrant for the truth of this premise. So yeah, I grant it 100% proven true status. Okay, so with that said, then we come to premise 3, which is actually our first sub-conclusion. And this says, okay, look, therefore, if God exists, then he must, among other attributes, be perfectly loving in the ordinary sense of the word, as generally understood by humans, at least to the maximal possible degree. This is automatically 100% proven true. And when I assign 100% proven true, I'm talking about the inference, because this is a sub-conclusion technically, right? So it serves as a premise number 3 in our main argument, but it's a sub-conclusion within a sub-argument. So we have premises 1 and 2, and using a valid argument pattern known as hypothetical syllogism, premise 3 or subconclusion 1 follows logically, necessarily, and inevitably from the truth of those premises. Since we've assigned 100% proven true or proven warranted in terms of premise 1 and 2, 100% times 100% equals 100% for subconclusion 1 or premise 3. So we know that this is true automatically in terms of premise 3. Great. What about premise number 4 then? Well, premise number 4 says, if God is not perfectly loving, in the ordinary sense of the word as generally understood by humans or in the 5 senses as advanced by Schellenberg, to the maximal possible degree, then God does not exist. Once again, this premise number 4, automatically by default, 100% proven true. Huh? You might say, what's going on? Well, it's because, look, premise 3 we already said is 100% proven true, right? If God exists positively, then he is positively perfectly loving, just to keep it simple, right? So that takes the form, if P, then Q. So P is a necessary and sufficient condition, a sufficient condition for Q. So through a rule of logic called contraposition, well, that would mean the reverse is also true. If not Q, then not P, right? Remember modus ponens versus modus tollens. So if P is true, then Q is true. That's logically equivalent to, well, then if Q is not true, then P is not true. Because we're saying the original way, if P, then Q is saying, well, P is sufficient to have Q. Every time you have P, you must have Q. If you flip it and say, yeah, but we don't have Q, not Q, then that's sufficient to say, well, not P then. So that's all we're doing here. 100% proven true in terms of the inference here through the contraposition rule in logic. You know, if P then Q, that's our premise 3. Reverse in premise 4 is also true. If not Q, then not P. Not P. And to illustrate this, how the logic works, so technically this is subconclusion number 2. The slide in front of you is technically wrong. So premise 4 counts as subconclusion 2, and then there's another subconclusion 3 later on. But to help you understand this, let me do what's called an argument diagram. When I was teaching critical thinking to the first-year university students, in one of my under one of my supervisors, we taught the kids what's called argument diagramming, and it's a helpful visual tool to visualize what role the premises and subconclusions play in the context of the main argument as a whole. So let me bring up a Zoom video of that for you guys here. Okay, so this is the argument diagram for our Divine Hiddenness Argument. There we go. And this will be on my blog page for people if you need to go over it. But it just shows you a visual representation of the structure of our argument with 10 statements here, right? So what we're going over is this left side, right? So 10 here is our main conclusion. So just so you understand how argument diagramming works. So circles represent a conclusion. Squares represent a premise. Now, if you see a square with a circle within it, that represents a subconclusion that serves as a premise in the main argument. The arrows represent the logical rules of inference. So for example, from premise 1 and 2, we're inferring the truth of the subconclusion premise 3 or statement 3 here. So that's how it works. Also, in terms of the underlining, these represent, if it's underlined, that means they are dependent premises in order to get the conclusion when you infer the conclusion, right? So you can't, in terms of statement 3 here, or premise 3, or subconclusion 1, whatever you want to call it, I'm just going by statements, so I can call the main conclusion 10, because obviously it doesn't make sense to call it premise 10, right? It's the main conclusion. So these are the statements, numbered statements here, corresponding to the premise numbers, with giving the main conclusion statement number 10 or premise number 10 as a label. So these are dependent. Premise number 1 on its own can't prove that 3 is true. Neither can 2 on its own prove that 3 is true. You need both together. And that's the hypothetical syllogism that we had, right? In this case, there's an independent premise. If there's no underlining, statement 3 totally by itself, you're allowed to infer the truth of subconclusion 4 or statement 4 here, which is a subconclusion. So as we're kind of, let me just hang on one second. Let me just share everything so I can go back and forth as need be. Okay, share and screen. All right, beautiful. Hopefully that's showing up for you. So you can see in terms of the main argument here in, let me just, all right, beautiful. So what we've been working on up to premise 4 is kind of the left side of our diagram, right? So you have premise 1, where if God, statement 1 here, which corresponds to premise 1, if God exists, then he's a real maximally great being. Premise 2, just the premise, if God is a real maximally great being, then he is a perfectly loving being in the whatever way we define perfectly loving there in premise 2. Together, these give us subconclusion 1 through hypothetical syllogism, which is son of a gun, which is statement 3 here. See, it's a subconclusion, and it also serves as a premise, giving us through contraposition, right? So hypothetical syllogism requires 2 premises, we get this. Then through contraposition with just this statement 3, we can infer that 4 is true, and 4 corresponds to the opposite, right? So if God exists, then he must be perfectly loving. But if God is not perfectly loving, then God does not exist. So that's basically what we've done so far. We've covered this part of the equation, solely focusing on what the concept of God is. Next, in premise 5, we're going to be looking at the next side of the equation, and we'll get to that. But that's, for example, well, great, if God exists and he's perfectly loving, then he'd want meaningful relationships with his peeps. So that's premise 5. Then we have premise 6, which is great. If God wants relationships, then he would ensure that all certain group of people, real seekers, would have a propositional conscious belief that God exists. And then those 2 together give us the subconclusion 7, which is basically just saying, yep, if God exists, then he would give everybody a belief, not all real seekers a belief unless he had reason not to. That's our incompatibility premise for 7. Then premise 8 represents a premise that's our empirical premise, that there are real seekers that lack belief in God. Therefore, we get 9, that there is no perfectly loving God. Therefore, since we know that God, if God exists, he must be perfectly loving, there is no perfectly loving God. Therefore, these 2 dependent premises together dependently prove the main conclusion that God does not exist. Or if you want to be technically precise, that the God final hypothesis is false. So that's in a nutshell how the argument works. I just wanted to give you kind of a visual reference so you understand. So far, we've only covered this side of the equation up to 4. And after I get back to the main recording, we'll be taking up with premise 5 here. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, back to the main recording.